We are now recording. Okay, thank you. Welcome again to the Philosophy of Whatever podcast, where we believe you can make philosophy out of whatever. I'm your co-host, James DiGiovanna, here with Timothy Ignafo. We are philosophers in the Department of Philosophy at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, the City University of New York. And we're very pleased to have our guest today, Sophie Grace Chappell, professor of philosophy at the Open University, who is well known for her work in ethics and ancient philosophy and translations from the ancient Greek. And today we'll be discussing her new book, Transfigured. Welcome, Sophie.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me on.
Okay, so I'm going to say that this book is one of my favorite philosophy books I've read of late, and you're using biography as part of an argument, which I think is great. And it reminds me a little of Susan Bryson's Aftermath. I don't know if you're familiar with that work. And I think she does a brilliant job with that. And Peter Godfrey Smith's Other Minds, where he talks about his personal interactions with octopuses. And you discuss the experience of growing up as a trans person in a time when there's an overwhelming, we'll still live in it, but worse, gender ideology about the barrier between male and female, which made your life incredibly difficult, as I think we can all imagine. So let me just start with this. The decision to use biography. Talk to us about why you thought that was important for this philosophical discussion.
Well, it didn't really feel like a decision. It felt like something I had to do. It felt kind of compulsory. I suppose I think there are different ways towards reaching an understanding of something. And in philosophy, we do tend to be dragged towards a sort of timeless model where you just say, here's one proposition, here's another proposition. Hey presto, given those two propositions by logic, we get the third proposition. And there are lots of things for which I think that model of argument doesn't really work. So, I mean, one of the things that you often want to establish, it's often crucially important to establish what philosophers sometimes rather condescendingly call mere facts, or, the plain facts of the case. Well, often the facts determine everything. The facts are what's crucial. And I think this is a case of that kind. If you're arguing about a historical personage, say Napoleon, then it would matter that people had met him. It would matter that we can frame a coherent story about Napoleon's life, about what he did, about where he went and who he met. So that's one thing to think about. I was talking about a historical narrative, and that I was doing that partly because lots of people who want to push back against the rights for trans people, they want to talk about historical narratives too. And very often what they want to do is deny us the veracity of the narratives that we want to tell. So these kinds of things are crucially important in trying to get clear on what it is that we're talking about. And it's not just that you need to get the facts right, you need to get the history right. It's often that this is actually the dominant way in which we understand ourselves and in which we argue. Even in philosophy, in ethics, a lot of the time what's really going on is, look, it's like this. This is how I saw it. This is what I understood. And just one more example of the way in which narratives can be important. Most of us have heard, I suppose, of Frank Jackson's famous thought experiment of Mary the color scientist and what happens to her when she leaves the black and white room in which she's always lived. She's always lived in there. She's never seen anything that's any color except black, white, and gray. And suddenly Mary is released from her room. She's sprung from her monochrome jail, and she sees the world. And Frank Jackson raises the question in an article in Philosophical Quarterly in the 1970s. He raises the question, so does Mary come to know something new? Now, there are lots of answers being proposed to that question about Mary. My answer is emphatically yes.
Yes.
And here comes Mary. I mean, she's kind of delirious. She's got a stream of things to tell us about her new experience. And she says, look, the world has lit up for me. Suddenly it's no longer like it used to be before. Look at all the things I can see. And so part of what I was doing in writing Transfigured the way I wrote it was saying, look, it's like this.
Yeah. And it's interesting because we actually have empirical evidence of something like the Mary case now. There are cases of people who've attained vision, born blind, and their response is, this is nothing like what I could have thought.
Yeah,
And also this new devices that allow people who are colorblind to see color, and we see this same effect, that they are just
yeah.
amazed, and it's brand new.
I,
Yes.
I saw recently on YouTube, and I couldn't give you a clip, but I urge listeners and audience to, I urge everybody to look it up because it's really amazing. There is footage on YouTube of small babies who've
Yes.
been born deaf, and a hearing aid is fitted in their ears, and they hate it, of course, as a baby would. This strange man's trying to push something into my ear, or a strange woman's, you know, got their thumbs all over me. What's going on? The baby hates it. And then the hearing aid goes in and it's switched on. And the expression on those children's faces when they hear for the first time. I mean, the first time I saw one of those, it reduced me to tears, actually.
Oh
It was
yeah.
just extraordinary. And it's the nearest thing I've seen in the real world to a liberation of Mary.
Right. Yes. The cochlear implants. My nephew, in fact,
Yeah,
wears those, and they're just astonishing. Yeah.
yeah,
And this, right. So this brings up something about your philosophical method in general. And there's two things you raise here. One is, and I, as a philosopher, 100% agree, the facts are important. I mean, I'm often appalled by people who make what sound like empirical claims in philosophy with no empirical backing.
yeah.
And a specific kind of fact that you're getting at is a personal fact, because in ethics, feelings count. And you said, it breaks my heart that people still have to go through what I went through when I was young. And I'll be honest, when I was reading your book, my heart broke repeatedly. I was very moved. And even I'll admit it, I was moved to tears at one point, and I had to put the book down for a second.
Wow.
Because I think many people understand what it is to be so misunderstood and to have no words to describe what's going on. And it was that experience that you put forward that grounds the book for me. And it just, I've always thought there was a viciousness to a sort of trans exclusion language. It always struck me as cruel. Um, and I think you explained that cruelty very well and couldn't have done it without the biography.
Yeah, thank you. I think the biography is crucial in just those ways. And it recenters philosophy in a way that I want to recenter philosophy. So this is the book plug bit.
Right.
Another book I've written recently, Epiphanies, is about those moments, like the baby who hears for
Right.
the first time, where suddenly things come into color and you see the world differently.
Right.
Um, there are experiences like that. And one of the things I'm very keen to say to other philosophers is, come on, guys, we need a broader and wider and more generous conception of what counts as rational argument,
Right.
because the argument of epiphanies is all about those wow moments. And an obvious question to raise about that is a question I worry about myself, is how does this work rationally? How does
Right.
this work logically? What's going on here, logically speaking? So there was a review of Epiphanies headed, "You owe me an argument." And
Oh,
I was kind of tearing my hair out
right.
when I saw that and saying, well, I've given you an argument, but you
Right.
don't recognize it as an argument because you have a constricted account of what counts as an argument. And I want to say, look, see, um,
Right.
behold, it's a form of argument that philosophers should take more seriously.
Absolutely. And that's why we need more voices from more perspectives, which has been a real problem in philosophy. And this brings us to this. You have a kind of particularism going on, in a sense, in that you say human experience, which is constantly contradicting theory, is the great test of truth. Um, and that if theory and experience don't match, it's almost always theory that needs to give way. And I think that that's right. But the thing that I want to press on is, it's very hard to say what experience is and how it particularly contradicts theory, because we're often mistaken in our interpretations of our experience. And that's something that you bring up. So you can't just have someone tell me, and I've had people say, well, I'm psychic. I know I'm psychic. I got this right, and they have what they believe is to be an experience of a psychic occurrence, but they're confused by confirmation bias and so on. So those are one area of experience, but there's another area that you get at. Um, and can you just tell our listeners about being, I think it was 4 when you had this, you asked your mother a question about going to school, and how that um, was bounded by the language you had available and your ability to understand your experience.
Yeah. Well, that was a formative episode, but it was so traumatic that I buried it really deeply. And it took me a long time to realize that that had even happened. And it's it's difficult to get hold of these things when you bury them. But over a period of time, it got clearer and clearer to me that this really had happened, and that this was kind of the skeleton in the cupboard in my relationship with my mother, um, which was in many ways a very happy and loving relationship. But it
I'm
was
sorry, can we
also,
just say what that describe the event, if you would?
well, the event was that um, I just started going to school, and I began to think it's the first time I'd clearly seen boys and girls sorted in that way.
Right.
And I began to think, hang on, I'm on the right side, the wrong side of this partition. I don't belong on the side where I've been sorted. I've been sorted with the boys, and that's not me. And I don't feel comfortable like this. And I don't like this school uniform. And this just isn't me. And if we have to sort people like this, then I want to be on the other side of that partition. That was what I wanted to say. I didn't have the words. I
Right.
couldn't express it. I don't remember exactly what words I used, but I know that asking for that, and I think it's very likely that I asked for it more than once because I'm an obstinate person and I
Mhm.
would. And if I really want something, I will keep asking. Um, and it just got me in trouble. And it, as I say, I think it created a kind of skeleton in the cupboard between my mother and me. There was this thing in the background which sometimes made her extremely and inexplicably angry with me, which was something that colored my childhood from then on. And in me, there was this thing that I wanted to recover about myself, which increasingly was just buried and became something that neither of us could admit was there.
Right.
Um, so it was, um, I'm sure a psychotherapist would have a great time with that experience. I have, in fact, talked to a psychotherapist about it. Um, and it's it's something that I think explains a lot about um, the ways in which I sometimes struggle even today. I mean, with a sense of being condemned, with a sense of not being right, with a sense of not being able to get where I really need to go or be who I really need to be. All of that is um, still there in my psyche, and
Mhm.
also this continuous sense that I'm not living up to standards that I
Right.
suffer from, which can make things very difficult, and it makes me into a kind of perfectionist and perhaps a workaholic, but it's not necessarily a healthy thing.
Right. So this is a result of gender ideology, the belief that lies in the background of our culture that there is this absolute distinction between the boys and girls. Like you said, you saw them sorted. Well, why were they sorted?
Mm,
A baby is born. The first thing someone says, is it a boy or a girl? Well, why is it the
yeah,
first thing you would ask? Is it healthy?
yeah,
Is it,
yeah,
um, and as you note, these gender ideologies vary across time and across place, and they're going to be different for different people, the way that they manifest. And yet, bizarrely, the people being accused of being gender ideologues are the ones who question this
yeah,
ideology without presenting an ideology, which is saying, well, what's up with this very
yeah,
strong distinction, when we could be saying, well, are they, greater or less than 1 meter? Why isn't that the most important thing in the world?
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so your opponents are, they're not the classical trans exclusionists, because those people kind of vanished. It's a new and I think more vicious version who's using legislation, Twitter, and a kind of popular discourse to make life uncomfortable for a certain group of people. Um, and I think Tim wanted to ask you a question about this in regard to the the way Twitter and such media works. Tim?
Hi,
Sure,
Tim.
absolutely. Hello, how are you doing? And
All right.
I also wanted to ask, I thought, James, where you're going was to ask about gender-based consciousness.
Oh,
There's
yeah, we're
quite a
going to
bit of.
get to that for sure. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm very interested in hearing about that and uh how it links into the idea of epiphany
Mm.
and how you approach and teach ethics. One thing I wanted to echo was, like with James, I was really moved by this book. I thought this was a great book. I really appreciate it. And
Thank you.
particularly I was drawn to your definition of philosophy. I
Hmm.
thought that was such a humane and refreshing definition as somebody that teaches ethics. I really liked learning about your how you evolved in your teaching of ethics and how you kind of shied away from the more philosophical parlor games that sometimes can an ethics class can kind of devolve into uh, and got into your way of thinking about and approaching these issues and talking about these issues. I found that
Thank you.
really refreshing. I found that really, really refreshing. Um, and I found the book eminently reasonable.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that. And in light of this, I did want to ask a little bit about Twitter. And this seems like such a reasonable work, such a great and accessible work, um, that I found it interesting that you cited Twitter so often and like the kind the and often without naming them, right? The arguments of Twitter trolls, and it
Yeah.
comes back to this question that I have in part, of where do we draw a line and how do we find that line of who is allowed within the context of a discourse in order for that discourse to be humane and civil and respectful and constructive, most importantly. um, and I also worry, and I should preface this with the ethics class I teach is ethics of information technology, so I'm acutely allergic to social media. I don't think of this as real discourse. I don't think of it as a place where the kind of philosophy you describe can really exist. And so, how do you grapple with social media?
Right.
That's a long
Well,
question. I know. I'm sorry. Yeah.
um, I grapple with it. I gave up on Twitter because I stopped going on Twitter because there was a kind of cost benefit analysis going on. And the benefit was, well, trans visibility, which I think is important, um, pushing back against false narratives, promoting true narratives, um, trying to pick holes in the gender ideology that's really controlling things, which is the trans hostile gender ideology. Um, Also, there was just hanging out and having fun with my friends on Twitter, which certainly happens sometimes. I just decided that the game, in the end, the game wasn't worth the candle, and that I was fed up of being abused all day long by people who didn't know the first thing about me. And one of the things that worries me most about the trans exclusionary side, as they present themselves on Twitter and elsewhere, is the ways in which they always seem to make everything all about them. So the existence of trans people is all about them. And we've just seen this in the UK with the Scottish Parliament has passed some hate law legislation, the point of which is to stop people being stalked and harassed and subjected to death threats in the street, actually, not on social media, not principally on social media. But lots of social media warriors on the trans exclusionary side have got on their high horses about this. And so this legislation, which is designed to protect various vulnerable minorities, including but not exclusively trans people, becomes, as far as they're concerned, all about trans people and about whether they can tweet, misgendering, insulting, accusations of sexual deviancy, personal impropriety, and indeed crime, about people, whether they're allowed to tweet that. And suddenly the whole thing becomes all about them. And in the end, you just get bored of this, and you ask the question, how should a place like Twitter be policed? Well, one reason why I'd never go back on Twitter is because it's been taken over by someone who thinks that it's okay to spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, that's just fine according to him. But it's not fine to use the prefix cis of woman or man to say a cis woman, you know, someone who's born a woman, a natal woman in the biological and physical sense. You're not allowed to use cis according to Elon Musk because that's hate speech. I just think that's ludicrous. And I want no part of that site while he's in charge. But when it comes to policing it, that's not something I can do. And you know, life is short. All I can do is walk away and find a different route, a different place to hang out with my mates and hang out with friendly people and discuss things in a civilized way, which is good stuff that goes on Twitter. And as far as I know, still goes on. So people like Tim Crane, Philip Goff, for example, I think are still on Twitter and still doing really interesting stuff, debating philosophy with each other. And that's fun. But I can get that elsewhere on social media. So normally nowadays, I'm on Facebook. And the way I run Facebook is very much this attitude of just avoid trouble, just avoid fights, because they go on and they're not fun. And you don't win them either by having good arguments. You win them by stamina. You win them by just keeping on pumping out the same messages. And so there's a real worry about Twitter and other social media with the rise of bots and of new generation AI. This means that you can get the bots to pump out the same false message about your target 30,000 times a day. Literally that, not an exaggeration. 10 times that if you pay more. And how do you combat that? I mean, I went on Twitter in the first place to say, you know, my trusty knight in shining armor, warrior for the truth kind of mode is how I went on Twitter. And I'm afraid I think that's naive. I'm all for free speech. I'm all for rational exchange. But I also think that troll bots do not have rights. They don't have free speech rights. They should just be sat on, disconnected, or set on fire, or whatever you do to a troll bot to disable it. They shouldn't be there at all because they're preventing people who do have rights, actual human, and for all I know, alien Twitter users, they're preventing them from having proper rational exchanges by sheer weight of numbers. They get in the way of reasonable and fair discourse. And so it's not like there aren't troll bots elsewhere, but what I always do is I just block them and move on and encourage other people to block them, because I think in my experience of blocking trolls, there's nothing they hate more than being blocked. They really don't like it when you block them. They want you to engage because they're probably working on some troll farm near Sverdlovsk or something, and they get points from the supervisor if they get engagement out of you. But if you just block them, if enough people block them, then the account goes down and they have to start up a new one, and it's a nuisance.
That is, I think, great in that it brings up something that people miss, which is that online people seem to think that debate is a very important mode of inquiry. But what they take as debate, and so it is, but what they take as debate is stamina, as you pointed out, just maintaining the same thing long enough. And debate is an important mode of inquiry if both parties come into it with the possibility of changing their minds, an openness to evidence, and arriving with evidential and well-grounded positions. And in general, you know, that's why a book or a paper is a great thing, because you can lay it all out clearly where you are, and then writing back and forth in that mode gives you time. But the online version is just to keep shouting the same thing, and you get points for misunderstanding and then misrepresenting your opponent.
Yeah, and all of that. I just can't be bothered with it. Life is short. It's no fun. And the thing that people sometimes say, that they feel guilty about being in their social media bubble, people say, and I always think, well, come on. If you go out for an evening in the pub, you don't feel that you have a moral duty to look for the nastiest pub in town, where you will meet the maximum number of bigots and have people shouting in your face all evening long. You go to the pub where your friends will be. And if that's fair about pubs, it's fair about social media, because no one has a duty to be on there in the first place. You go there for fun. If it's not fun, don't do it.
Yeah, and I love reading philosophical papers that I vastly disagree with. But there's some bumpers on that, in that the people hopefully have done their homework and are there for a real debate. And I've watched philosophers change their mind, and I've changed mine. Every philosopher has, if you're a true philosopher.
Me too.
Oh yeah. I
not
know
least transgender. I mean, I used to think, I used to be earlier in my career, say around 2002, I was in many ways on bioethical issues, what people call a conservative
Mhm.
um, philosopher. And that was for reasons connected with my faith. And the big turnaround for me was to do with realizing that actually God didn't want me to be against all those things. And one good reason why God didn't want me to be against them was because at least some of them were right there in my nature. And the lady was protesting too much.
Right. Yeah, just as experience trumps theory, it's going to have to trump deductions from faith, which
Yeah,
of course is where we can always go wrong in any.
yeah.
I
Can
know.
I ask a quick
But
follow-up on the topic of respectful discourse?
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, you include a letter you wrote to J.K. Rowling,
Okay.
and I think that was originally published in Crooked Timber or The Guardian.
That's right. Yes.
That's
Yes.
right. And
And
I,
on the blog of the APA.
Hmm.
and okay, when this was the first time reading it in this book. I hadn't read it before. I was struck by how nice it was and how respectful it was, and it was almost like a fan letter. And I wanted to know, did she ever follow up? Did J.K. Rowling follow up? Did you end up having this conversation? Because it's kind of an invitation to discuss this.
Yes, I was very keen to start a conversation. I got an acknowledgement from her press secretary. Um, I haven't heard back from her since. I've occasionally seen her on Twitter. Um, I'm not aware that I've made any difference to the lady's trajectory.
Oh
But
yeah.
there you go. You try and engage with people, and if it doesn't work, then you try something else. You try not to fret about it too much. You just do something else.
That
But
was,
yeah,
and
I thought it was important to put that in the book because I think, I mean, I did actually think there was a little bit of a risk putting the letter to J.K. Rowling in the book. I thought there was a risk of what I was talking about before, namely making the debate all about the opponents of trans people, not about trans people. And I think that danger persists. I'm sure there will be people who read Transfigured, you know, these people who go around on Twitter saying, "Oh, I'm an expert on transgender," by which they mean is they've memorized a lot of anti-trans argument, and they've published an anti-trans book. And I know that people like that on Twitter will be thumbing through Transfigured to see if they're mentioned, and will immediately condemn the book if they're not even mentioned. And you know, spoiler: no, you're not mentioned. None of you are, apart from J.K. Rowling, if she counts as an anti-trans activist. Um, so they make it all about them, and that worried me putting the letter in. But I thought it was a problem to focus on someone who's actually, I'm afraid, the way things go, it doesn't seem wrong to me to perceive her as an opponent of trans people or what she thinks of as trans ideology. But in the end, I decided to put it in because she's such a focal figure in this debate now. In many ways, the debate has, for many people, become all about her. And so it seemed sane and sensible to face up to that and try and engage with her and try and pick up points.
I'm glad you left it in. I really enjoyed it, and I think that it kind of accentuates your argument, and it
Thank you.
helps frame the entire book. In my opinion, it's disappointing she didn't respond, but I think it's
Well,
the kind of letter that will change a lot of other people's minds.
one thing that I was thinking about when I wrote that letter was I was visualizing the feelings of young people who are J.K. Rowling fans and maybe are trans themselves, and things have happened to them, like, for example, the Mirror of Erised, which was an image in, I think it's the first book or the second book, I can't remember now, but the Mirror of Erised, where Erised is desire backwards, desire in mirror image. So you look in that mirror and you see yourself as you wish you really were. And that moved me because, of course, you can guess what I thought. I looked in the mirror and I saw myself as I want to be. And, you know, I just thought how it would feel for a child who was living in one gender and desperately desired to live in the other gender. I just thought how that would feel for them to go through that imagery and get out of it what I got out of it, and then find that J.K. Rowling, despite all the things she said about being against bullying, you know, the wonderful Sirius Black line, if you want to know what a man is really like, look how he treats his inferiors. Look how he treats the outcast and the people on the margins of society. Well, I think some of my moral heroes really passed that test very well, notably Jesus of Nazareth and Mahatma Gandhi. But there are other people who I don't think do pass that test so well, I'm afraid.
That was actually the part of the book that brought me to tears, because the idea of being so kind to someone who has been so cruel, I just thought that was the best of philosophy. That if a philosopher can do anything, it is to stay calm and maintain reason and rely on something like, here's what I went through, and I'll tell it to you as it is, without falling into the name calling. And yes, I got that same image of these children who read these books and now hear this from this woman. And I don't want to get too much into J.K. Rowling for the reasons you said, but everyone should read that letter, even if only for how graciously you answered someone who has referred to trans women as, and I quote, the rapists. So, which is so absurd and so hurtful, and nothing hurts more than a vicious lie about you, that's well spread.
I mean, just to address that trope very quickly, I always think, either we're coked out of our minds on feminizing drugs, and so we actually have no libido, and that's what's wrong with us, or we've had surgery, so we haven't even got the requisite genitalia to be rapists,
right.
or we're rapists. Which is it? Get your story straight.
Yeah, I know. And you do a great job point by point addressing the things that these anti-trans people online have said. And so I hope people will pick it up. You could take several parts of this book and make your own book a new book out of them. And one, I think every philosopher who reads this is going to say, gendered consciousness, that chapter is great. And it isn't just gendered consciousness. You're talking about something much more real and grounded than the old-fashioned idea of embodied consciousness. You're talking about particular bodies in particular places. So just to say consciousness is embodied, we're in that abstract world of philosophy where I imagine an artist's model figurine of a human experiencing the world. But you're saying, and I think right, and many the philosophers will back you up. Charles Mills, I think, gives this in his discussions of the forms of white ignorance, that of course consciousness is going to be particular, and again getting pictures. So why don't you say what brought you to the notion of gendered consciousness and explain it for those who are listening?
Well, the question in the paper is consciousness gendered?
Right.
Meaning, very crudely, does consciousness come in a masculine flavor and a feminine flavor? And I was also asking, as well as asking, is consciousness gendered? I was asking, is it sexed?
Right.
So does it come in a male flavor and a female flavor? And I was also, of course, asking a question about those questions. I was asking, is this a good thing? Is this how we want it to be? Is this how it should be? And I think the results that you get from asking those questions are pretty interesting, and I'm still thinking about them. But very briefly, I want to start with the body, the sexed body. And I think this is the thing that trans exclusionary theorists and ideologues get wrong about us all the time. They think we don't think about the body, or we discount the body, or we're Platonists, meaning that we ignore the body. Actually, I am a Platonist, but I'm not that kind of Platonist. I'm not a dualist. I'm just interested in Plato's ideas, and I think he's a very rich resource. I think the greatest thing about Plato is probably the way he writes philosophy. But anyway, I'm getting distracted. So I want to start with the sexed body, and I want to say, does human experience of being bodily come in male flavors and female flavors? And the answer to that is yes, of course it does. And of course, there are marginal cases, in not just in the sense that they're intersex people, and not just in the sense that there are trans people, but also in the sense that people deviate from, in one way or another, from the stereotype, in the non-pejorative sense of that word, of being male or female. But typically males have larger and more muscular bodies, and typically women's bodies are more um, more suited for childbearing, etc., etc. So does consciousness have a sex? Is consciousness sexed? Yes, it is, because part of what happens to us is that all of us perceive each other, and just as Charles Mills and others have pointed out, we perceive each other racially. The eyes are very powerful. We perceive each other as potential threats of violence, or as potential sources of comfort and gratification, or as other bodied people who will be on the same side as us on either side of this divide. And that's all very crude, but that's roughly the kind of thing that you might say about, is consciousness sexed? And I actually quote in that chapter a bit from the Iliad, from book 1, where a woman who has not been allowed to speak and who is an object of contention between two warlords in a Bronze Age army fighting around the campfire over this woman, she is taken from one of them and given to the other, and she never gets to speak a word throughout the whole of this encounter. So that's the sexing of the body and the way it affects our lives and our consciousness. Because, of course, in a Bronze Age society, it is literally about your body and what you can do with it. They don't have guns, they don't have tanks, they don't have drones, they just have their own bodies and the powers of those bodies. And on the basis of just those bodily powers, they erect this enormously oppressive, the ancient Greeks do, the Homeric Greeks do, this enormously oppressive politics, which marginalizes and often just erases females.
Right.
So then, you want to put in a question there, or shall I go on to gender and consciousness alongside
No, I
sex?
just wanted to add in, and not just in the ancient Orthodox, in the United States, marital rape was legal until
Yeah.
1993. A
Yeah.
woman couldn't open a checking account until or credit card, get a credit
Yeah.
card till 1974. And still, often oppression is invisible to us. But as you point out, I think wonderfully, is there is something about constantly being observed.
Yes.
And the way women are looked at, the way a trans person is looked at is, of course, going to shape consciousness. The way a Black man walking into a white neighborhood is looked at is going to be that. So go ahead. Yes, sorry.
Yeah. So, yes, absolutely. And one thing you become immediately aware of when you transition and when you start appearing in public as a trans woman, or for that matter, as a trans man, it is, as you say, James, so much about the look. Then you realize that people are looking at you in a completely different way. Basically, they're sizing you up in a different way if you're a woman from how they size you up if you're a man. And they do size you up if you're a man too. So, you know, the 3 Fs, the fight, flee, or fornicate trio are right there in a lot of our not very well disguised primitive psychology a lot of the time, and that kind of sizing up goes on. And I think that sizing up, incidentally, while we're on the subject, I think it is part of what ensures the very asymmetric reactions that you get in society to trans women and to trans men, because trans women are seen as somehow a disappointment to men. They're cheating men, because women are supposed to be luscious and sexually approachable. And this, of course, is this heterosexual thinking, but within that thought frame, women are supposed to be sexual opportunities. And if you're a man and you're not gay and you're confronted with a trans woman, you think something like "curse has foiled again," or "I've been cheated," or something like that.
Right.
And that provokes a violent follow-up reaction. And I think that primitive psychology is all over the place in the way trans women get treated, actually. And our trans brothers, the trans men, don't get that level of viciousness. They get attacked in a different way,
Right.
also on, I think, pretty Neolithic grounds. They get attacked for being, they're just dismissed.
Right.
They're no longer proper women, so they're not even a sexual opportunity anymore. And they're in the dustbin, comprehensively in the dustbin, and accused of being mentally ill quite often. So we're accused of being rapists, they're accused of being mentally ill. That's how
Right.
it goes.
There was
and-
recently, I was going to say, Elliot Page, who famously is
Yeah.
transitioned male. There was a meme going around of a picture of him before he transitioned, and I guess looking attractive. And the quote is, "Look what they've taken from us," as though this sexually available woman is. And you weren't going to be having sex with Elliot Page to start with. Nothing was taken from you. You know.
Yes, yes, yes. Isn't it extraordinary? And of course, they don't also have the thought which they might have when you look at some of the trans women who are incredibly beautiful and just fill me with sort of bitch envy. They really do. I mean, they're not thinking about them. Oh, look what we've been given here.
Right.
If you're going to take this privileged view about other people as sexual objects for your pleasure, then you might as well play fair and say, well, actually, the trans women add something to the stock of what we can rule over, but they don't seem to do that either. So yeah, that was all just about consciousness and sex. Consciousness and gender. Well, I think the gendered roles. I agree with what I guess is a consensus in feminist philosophy and philosophy of sex. The gendered roles follow from and mirror the sex roles. So your gendered role is the role in your society of what your perceived sex is. And then what that can be can vary enormously and can change over time, as thank God it has changed a great deal in the last half century or so. But we're still stuck with an awful lot of gendered ideology. So to come to the good thing, is it a good thing question? I guess I'm saying, well, I get in trouble sometimes with trans theorists for saying this. I think that the bodily differences are real. And I think that for a lot of people who don't much encounter trans people, it does look like there's pretty much a straight sexual binary. And there are ways in which that could be challenged, both technologically and also politically. And maybe at times it should be challenged. But I think facing up to the fact that biological differences are real doesn't do the trans cause any harm at all.
Nope.
And the kind of trans activists who want to downplay biological differences, I don't necessarily find myself on board with them all the time, and I'm sure they don't find themselves on board with me, because what I want to say, and there's that Vatican pronouncement the other day, they just issued a pronouncement on, this is how it begins: men and women biologically are as different can be. And I'm thinking, yes, with you so far, okay. I think your rhetoric's a bit overdone, because I don't think, as a friend of mine, Nicholas Denyer, put it on Facebook the other day, I don't think I am more like a peahen and a female shrimp than I am like a peacock or a male shrimp. I don't think the difference is the greatest difference there is in nature, but yes, there is a big difference biologically between men and women. Fair enough. And then that's how it begins. But then we go on from that to, therefore, we can't have trans people. And I'm thinking, whoa, hold up. How does that follow? What you've just shown is simply that you've just shown that the divide between biological males and biological females is a big divide. Okay, fair enough. What follows? You say, therefore, there can't be trans women or trans men. Why not start from that premise and say, so it must be really hard to be a trans person because you're born wanting to be on the other side of a really big partition that you were unlucky enough to be born or destined in whatever way. You were destined or you were born, at any rate, on the wrong side of this divide. And it's a really big divide, says the Vatican. That ought to lead us to the conclusion, I think, that let's be really compassionate to trans people, because they're longing for a Jerusalem that is absolutely off in the clouds and really distant from them and really hard to get to. And for those who start young enough on the physical journey, hormones and puberty blockers and surgery and whatever, for those who start off early enough, they might end up, if they're really lucky, being really beautiful in the gender that they weren't born in. For other people, perhaps, dare I say it, people like me, that journey, that full journey, just isn't going to be possible or practicable. And so the Vatican, I think, ought to be saying we should have more compassion for trans people in that situation, because they've been dealt a really tough hand.
Right. That does bring up this question, which I think you handle nicely in the book, on conceptual engineering and bendy concepts, and these range of differences. You quote Aristotle, prostimen, prosaladou, some are, people vary a lot. And so when we look at something like, well, the Vatican saying men and women is the biggest difference, I consider myself more different from a rock than from a woman. In fact, there's very few things that I'm, less unlike than other humans, whether male or
Absolutely.
female. And we could make a huge deal about height if we wanted to. We could say, well, anyone under this height goes in that group, anyone over here. And we don't do that. And we don't do it with eye color or some other things. But the concept of male and female have been so reified by history of gender ideology. But as you point out, they're bendy concepts. In other words, they've altered over time. We've changed them. What counts? There are cultures well before ours that have accommodated trans people with categories that perhaps are restrictive, but at least there's a space.
Yeah. And this is one of the things I wanted to say about concepts in general, is that there's always an element of choice and selection
Right.
in what we choose to make salient and what we don't choose to make salient. You talk about height, James, and take the introvert extrovert divide. I don't know actually if that's good, solid, scientifically based psychological talk, but let's go with it for now. Let's suppose it is. There's a real difference between introverts and extroverts. I can readily imagine a society which is built upon that distinction and which isn't really interested in the distinction between those who have large gametes and those who have small gametes, or however we want to put that distinction, the sex distinction.
Right.
I can readily imagine a society built on that distinction, and it would have quite a lot of features which in some ways would be analogous to a binary sex society. For example, it might well be that the extroverts think the introverts are a bit feeble and pathetic. And the extroverts take all the limelight, and the extroverts take all the plum jobs and all the political power, etc., etc. But they also secretly know that the introverts have a role, because the introverts can go off in the back room and come up with something amazing like Einstein's two theories of relativity or whatever. So the introverts have this secret hidden away place. And maybe the extroverts actually do what, Agamemnon and Achilles do at the beginning of the Iliad. They fight over the introverts and they say, you're my introvert. You get in my back room and you cook up fancy theories for me, not for that bastard over there. It's not inconceivable that the society could be based on that difference too.
For sure.
And it might be just as oppressive as the patriarchy.
And it's
just as open as a potential society that we could move towards, if only we had the imagination and the courage.
And I love the way you've put that, because like you said earlier, very few people are the stereotypical male or the stereotypical female, right? And in fact, very few people are the stereotypical introvert or extrovert. But if we decided that was the rule, we'd put everyone into the two groups, just as the very thin boy who doesn't like sports and would rather play with dolls, but is in no way trans, is going to get shoved over by verbal abuse about their girlishness, to let them know they're in the wrong side, even though they're not announcing I'm trans. They're going to be told this because this binary is important, and we know what the two sides are like, and that reifies the difference. And it would be true, I think, exactly in your introvert extrovert world. You'd wind up with a world where, unlike ours, where most people are in the middle, but we definitely have that people would be pushed into the groups.
Well, actually, I mean, just on my slim acquaintance with American high school society, which largely goes back to the wonderful film Ferris Bueller. Actually, in many ways, the introvert-extrovert distinction in high school society, it seems like it is reified and solidified and taken very seriously. So the wonderful bit where the receptionist lady, is saying to the principal of Ferris's school, everybody in school loves him. They think he's a righteous dude. And then she lists all these groups, like the dweebs and the nerds, who admire Ferris. And I think nerd and dweeb actually clearly are terms for introverts. And so this distinction between introvert and extrovert is valorized right there. And if you're a jock or a high school or a prom queen or whatever, then you're on the extrovert side, and hooray for you. So actually, it's not just a theoretical possibility that people might be discriminated against along that line. They actually are.
Right, right. I will say my high school experience never matched those movies. I lived in a town where a very large high school, so there were 800 people, and it was impossible for there to be this simplicity. And it was nice because it was just lots of different groups and no clear sense of hierarchy. So those movies always bug me, but I think they're true of smaller Midwestern high schools.
Hey, you're saying Ferris stretches reality?
I think it may a bit, but in any event,
Who knew?
there was one last thing I definitely want to get to, and then I want to kick to Tim, which is you and I have something very similar to say about something that Parfit wrote, which is the empty question. And I have to briefly explain this. Parfit said that certain philosophical questions are empty. For example, say there's a watch, it has 100 pieces. If I replace one piece, is it the same watch? If I replace two? Well, when we do surveys on this, we find most people say that it's still the same watch at one, although a small percent say not the same watch. At 100% change, almost everyone says not the same watch. Some people say it is if the change took place slowly. And in the middle, there's a lot of dispute on this.
Yeah.
And what Parfit says is, well, there's no disagreement on facts. We all know how many parts have been removed. We're just disagreeing on the use of same. And so it is, as he puts it, an empty question. Years ago, I wrote a paper. It's called Literally Like a Different Person, Context and Concern in Personal Identity, where I say, well, same person, which is actually what Parfit was writing about, is something that is context dependent. Even if it's an empty question, it can become important. So if it's a question of, do you own this stuff? There's a woman named Sue Mack who had a head injury, lost all her memory, became essentially a 2-year-old and came back, and she still owned her stuff. But would she have been held liable for crimes committed before this? Well, I think there we'd have to say, I hope, not the same person.
Yeah.
And you say the same thing here about the empty question. I think you say it really well, which is that something is hanging on this, though, when we use these empty terms. And can you say a little about that and how it affects what you've just been talking about, this male-female divide, and why there's maybe a bendy space in male and female and so on?
Well, I think that, as you say, questions they can look empty in metaphysics
Right.
when they're not at all empty in politics,
Right.
Or in ethics, because we need to make a decision about what we're prepared to allow to be categorized with what. And sometimes you can avoid such categorizations altogether. You can just step away from them and say, look, who cares which you are? It doesn't matter. You're welcome anyway. But sometimes it matters to make those categorizations, not least to the people involved.
Right.
So, for example, with men and women, you have lots of people who are wanting to be identified in the opposite gender category from the one they were born in. And it's not like the facts are in dispute when someone wants this. It's not like it's in dispute that you were born with a male body, say, and that you now want to be categorized as a woman. And that's my own case. Now, this question where we know all the facts, we're not disputing the facts, no one's deluded about the facts. I don't falsely suppose that I was born female. I wasn't, and I know that. But the reason why it matters is to do with people wanting to occupy certain positions in society, wanting to occupy certain roles or identities, and to be recognized and accepted in those identities. And so I draw an analogy with adoption. Adoptive parents are usually a category that we don't struggle with. It is possible, it's certainly possible, unfortunately, to make a big fuss about that category. We could go around saying, oh, you're not a real parent, or you're denying basic biological facts by claiming to be a parent. But we don't do that because these people want to be recognized as parents, to be identified as the parents of these children, to live as the parents of those children. And so the question that I ask in the adoption analogy is, if you can do that for adoptive parents, what's so difficult about doing it for trans people, for recognizing them in the social roles and identities that they're comfortable in and that they want to live in? And again, I mean, you could take other things too. So lots of people gain a doctorate and become Dr. Di Giovanna instead of Mr. Di Giovanna, and nobody struggles with that change. But you've changed in a small way. You've changed your identity. If you marry, or if you become a biological father, you've changed your identity again, or if you become a Catholic priest, you become a different kind of father. And people are quite happy with these changes of identity. They don't struggle with those. So why struggle with the case of being trans? There's just prejudice and ideology behind
It's
the
ideology,
so
yeah. And as
I,
a step parent, I've never been questioned on this.
yeah,
Unfortunately, in the US, there's a group of right-wing Christians. This would include one of our representatives, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who said to a woman testifying before Congress who was talking about her child, who she did not give birth to, she said, "You are not a parent." There's a sports announcer named Al Troutwig who, discussing Simone Biles, the greatest
yeah,
gymnast who ever lived, whose parents adopted her, he said, "Those are not your parents." So there are people, but what was nice is most people said, "Why are you being rude like this?"
yeah,
Can't we just say that about trans too? If Tim here,
yeah,
when he was young, was known as Timmy Tim, and he asked me, "Please, would you not call me Timmy Tim?" It would be obscenely rude for me to go around introducing him as Timmy Tim. So
yeah,
I'm sorry that it may be difficult to remember pronouns, but just in politeness, you attempt it. And I've never seen people get furious about a mistake. They just correct you. And that's how it should be. It's a question, as you're wondering, of just common courtesy here.
yeah,
And
yeah.
the roles are flexible. Of course they are, and they change all the time. I want to make
I
sure
had a
folks.
friend. I had a friend who was born with one name, and he had a somewhat problematic relationship with his father. And after a lot of um, grief and struggle, he came to the point where he thought, well, I just want to cut the ties. And one way to symbolize that I'm cutting the ties with all that trauma is I'm going to change my name.
Right.
And I forget what he changed his name from. You know, it was Miles to Ian or something like that.
Mhm.
And everyone thereafter called him Ian, and no one struggled with that.
No one
And they
struggled.
recognized and understood what he was doing and went along with it.
Because they weren't
We can do it if we
influenced
try.
by, yeah, sorry, yeah, they didn't have this oppressive ideology about that.
Yeah, exactly. I
Tim
should
had a,
say, incidentally, one thing I wrote a while back, while I was still in the closet about being trans,
mhm,
I was writing about Bernard Williams'
right.
famous essay, The Macropolis Case. And um, Williams makes a great deal of fuss, in my opinion, too much fuss,
Mhm,
although I'm quite a fan of Williams, but I think he's wrong about this. He says, well, for um, for Sophie Grace to be the kind of person who would enjoy eternal life, she'd have to become a totally different person, so different that she'd no longer be the same person, and therefore she has no reason to be interested in immortal life, eternal life. And I thought at that point, I went, well, hang on a minute. All sorts of people become different people,
right.
and it's not obvious that just because after a certain change I will no longer be the same person, that I have no reason to care about the future me who won't quite be me, who is a bit disconnected with me.
Right.
And so I think, there are cases where actually ceasing to be the very person you were all along wouldn't be such a bad thing. I mean, hell, after all, a lot of us um, are not very happy with the people we are
Right.
and would give a great deal to become a new person, would love to become a new person.
Mhm,
So I think Williams dismisses the possible attractiveness of becoming a new person much too quickly.
right. I'm actually writing a book on immortality right now, and I'm saying some similar things. But yeah, if you think of a long, extended life, then you're going to have to accept that people will undergo a vast amount of change.
Yeah,
And again, just courtesy, common sense, and making our categories amenable to this is the need.
yeah.
I know Tim really wanted to ask you about epiphanies. We said on this, I would take the lead because I'm so fond of your book and it crosses there. But I want to kick back to Tim immediately here for this.
Oh, sure. Yeah. If I don't know how much time we have, but I just wanted to kind of go back to your work on epiphanies and your connection between epiphany and how this has affected your approach to philosophy and your approach to teaching philosophy. Uh, I found that really compelling and very interesting, and a very compelling part of the argument that I think is really fleshed out here in this book. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that.
Oh, okay. Well, yes, I think it's to do with the narrative way of thinking about ethics that I want to argue for. I think it's very rare in philosophy that I sit down wanted to persuade James of something and say, look, here's a premise, here's another premise. And now, lo and behold, out of those, here comes the conclusion. It's very unlikely that I'd do that. It's much likelier that I would sit down with James and say, listen, I need to tell you about something, and unpack a narrative to him. And out of that narrative, James, if all goes well, if my argument works, James will see what I'm talking about, and James will come to say, yeah, you're right. That is really important. And this is one of the big connections, I think, between philosophy and literature. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in literature as a philosopher and why I write poems myself. Because what I see, not all poems, of course, and not all literature, but what I see a lot of poems and literature doing is presenting an argument of that kind. They say, look, here's something to think about. Here's something really extraordinary that I've seen and that I'd like you to understand and think about too. And of course, literature often then complicates the plot by presenting an alternative to that vision and saying, well, you might think about it that way, but actually, what about this as well? It's more complicated, isn't it? So I want that kind of complexity in philosophy too, without philosophy actually becoming literature, which it's no need to do, and let literature be literature and philosophy be philosophy. That's fine. But there's something about the narrative shape of argument that we can learn from, and you find the most unexpected people engaging in narrative forms of argument. One of my favorite examples of this, which I quote in Epiphanies, is the example of Peter Singer, who presents in Animal Liberation an argument which is supposed to be a straight up utilitarian argument against causing animals pain. It's meant to start with the premises, causing pain is bad. Animals can feel pain. Causing animals pain is bad, so we shouldn't do it. It's meant to go something like that, which is fair enough, and it's an argument I largely endorse. But Singer begins Animal Liberation by telling the story of how he became an animal liberationist. So even in someone who's as much against, as far as I can see, the narrative form of philosophy as it's possible to be, you still get narrative frames being used. And actually, Singer, when you read him, is full of juicy little examples and stories and anecdotes about how badly things go wrong if you ignore his utilitarian principles. That's the point of the stories he tells. So I guess I want to say, look, this isn't just journalistic adornment that he's engaging in here. This isn't just a bit of colouring in to make things more rhetorically appealing. This is actually very often, even for a writer like Singer, where the main force of the argument is coming from. And let's think about that. Let's write about it. Let's talk about it more and explicitly on its own terms. And for God's sake, let's stop pretending we're not doing it,
Right.
because we are doing it. And that needn't be dishonest. Let's talk about it. So that was part of how I got into thinking about epiphanies.
That's interesting, because for me, one of the things that draws me to a lot of Anglo-American philosophy is the use of narrative examples. And I love Parfit for that reason. For example, he's just loaded with bizarre science fiction narrative examples. But I think there's been a turn towards, and I love the science fiction examples, but these real world narratives have been entering more with Susan Bryson, Charles Mills, yourself, Peter Godfrey Smith. And I'm so impressed with that turn, which doesn't take away from the fun science fiction ones. But we have to say, look, the narratives are important, but narratives come from a perspective, and we need more different perspectives to gain understanding, because when we walk out of the black and white room, we see color. But if we can't walk out of our own heads for a minute and listen to someone else's narrative, then we never notice what Martin Luther King refers to, the humiliation that is experienced by a person who walks into a store with a sign that says no blacks, or who wants to go to the amusement park that says no blacks. That has to be told with a degree of narrative. And you do, I mean, this is, again, I don't want to like just blow smoke up your butt, but this is a great book for this reason, that you spell out the narrative at length with consistent philosophical asides as needed, explication of terms, so that by the time you're done with that first narrative, I think we're well situated in the pain that was imposed upon you by gender ideology, and that was an unnecessary pain in a different imaginary world that would have been just, where things would have been fine. So I want to say, please, everyone, you don't need a degree to read this book. Sophie Grace has written a truly philosophically astute book while clarifying anything that might be a strange philosophical term. I do think there's more to be said on it. I hope you follow up with a book on this notion of consciousness that you're putting forward. And even just, it would be lovely to see just a paper by you on this, on what Tim said was so great, your definition of philosophy. Philosophy should be a loose bordered range of inquiries that are kept rigorous, maybe even austere, by different but complementary requirements of logic. And you go on explain what that, and this other thing that you call come off it, which we've always got to be careful with. The slogans will work for and against us. I hear gender exclusionists say, oh, come off it, but there's a deep sense here in which hit ground, let's touch ground.
Yes.
And going into the kind of particularism you use, which I think is very respectful of theory, and in some way that some particularisms are dismissive of. By the way, I keep using particularism is in philosophy to say that the particular trumps the theoretical. Essentially, that would be the short version. And methodism is to say that the theory trumps the particular experience. Okay, I want to give you a chance to say anything else that you need to say as we close up here that we didn't give you a chance to say yet.
Well, one thing that's worth saying is that I'm very conscious of the relativist question about my project. And so what I do want to say, and I mean it as sincerely as the Quakers mean it, I want to say, heed the spirits in Quaker terminology. Heed the showings, heed the revelations, heed what people think they're hearing, no matter whether they're officially on your side or officially on the other side. You've got to be open to them and you've got to listen to what they're saying, but in a spirit of discernment. So there's a famous passage in the New Testament, I think it's the letters of John, where he says, brothers, test the spirits. And this is precisely what he means, that when you think you've got hold of some revelation, you've got to test it. You've got to think about it. You've got to see whether it really adds up. So there's kind of two phases. And the first is to listen, genuinely to listen to each other. And the second is to sift and to sort out what we hear. And both those stages are crucial. And we don't do enough listening in philosophy in general. And we have, I think, a mistaken conception of sifting, because what people regularly say is, oh, you've got all these different accounts of what your precious experiences are, your wonderful epiphanies. We've got all these different accounts, but we need theory to sort out which is the true one. People regularly say to me. And I want to put my foot down at that point and say, no, actually, the sifting is also experiential. And actually, very often, it's the other way around. You don't need theory to sort out which epiphanies are true. You need epiphanies to sort out which theories are true. So it works in both directions. And you have to accept that a lot of the sifting that needs to be done with the experiences that people have thought that they've had does not take the form of most contemporary philosophy. It's something else. It's, as I say, it's more like discernment. It's a matter of testing which narratives and which claims to have had epiphanies ring true and make sense. And that involves self-reflection too. It's not just that you're reflecting on someone else's report of what they think is important. It's also that you're saying to yourself, well, what does it say about me that I can't see what this guy's getting at all? That I can't hear this story. This doesn't make sense to me. Because it could be a limitation in you that you can't hear it, or it could be a limitation in the story. It could be that someone else has too narrow a perspective. So I'm trying to set up the foundations now for my new project, which is going to be called Irreversible Enlightenments, and which is that's meant to be heard with a question mark on the end, because it's all about the question: are there any irreversible enlightenments? Is it possible to get hold of some epiphanic vision and to be in a place where you've made a kind of progress that will never be reversed, you'll never go back from, that nobody could reverse? And then I want to ask, what kind of could do you mean? And obviously, someone can just shoot me, and that will get rid of all the advances I've made pretty quickly. I'm more interested in, could somebody argue me out of them? And if they did argue me out of them, would that be mere brainwashing or, sophistry and bad argument? Or could they get me out of what I think by good arguments? So I'm interested in doing what Plato talks about in the Meno. He says, Meno starts by saying to Socrates, can virtue be taught? And by the end of the dialogue, Socrates is saying, what we need to get beyond mere true belief is a way of binding down the statues, a way of fastening these true beliefs so they don't wander off, so that they don't get reversed by a logos, by a rational understanding. I'm very interested in trying to turn true belief into knowledge in that kind of way, and to look at the various ways in which that might happen, which aren't necessarily a matter of rationalistic argument. They might be of something quite different from that. So I guess what I'm saying is, to those who are wondering about epiphanies, well, what about the relativist objection? And those who are wondering about transfigured, well, that's your experience, but what about somebody else's? I'm thinking very hard about those questions, and watch this space, because maybe the next book will answer them,
And
and
you
maybe
do
not.
wonderfully say repeatedly, well, this has been my experience, and other people have told me this, but certainly there are other experiences. And
Yeah,
again, that's also what philosophy is missing, the idea that you can't just introspect to universal and
yeah,
and you get it right every time. And you are great on that. Like you even say, I'm sure somebody behaved in this horrible way this troll talked about, but just because one person did that, let's not, that's not
yeah,
something to
yeah,
abstract from, to universalize from.
yeah. I mean, I always want to say to people who have a kind of demonized view of trans people, um, look, I'm sorry that someone has given you this hard time in the past.
Right.
I'm sorry that that happened to you, but um, can we go into this a bit, please? Because what you've got hold of there may be a truth, but it's not the truth.
Right.
It's not. It may be a truth about some trans person. It's not the truth about trans
Trans
people.
people, right? And that's how
Um,
stereotypes work
yeah,
in the
yeah,
bad sense. Yeah.
yeah,
I hope everyone reads your letter, at least your letter to J.K. Rowling, to understand exactly what you just said, which is this. I think, plenty of trans people want to be reasonable. In my experience, the overwhelming majority. And here you are, not just being reasonable, but being reasonable to someone who said mean and insulting things, and you let that slide. Um, in the sense of not bringing it back into the argument. You say, here's why we shouldn't do this politely. And thank you for that. And thank you so much for coming on our show. We really appreciate it. Tim, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I wanted to echo the gratitude. I think it's an excellent book. Thank you very much. It's a great book, and it's your way of argument here and the letter are inspiring and a really good model.
Thank you. I mean, I could wish for nothing better for this book than that it should help people to see what's really going on in these debates, which for many people are just a kind of abstract, fur-flying cage fight. Well, those of us who have skin in the game are losing quite a lot of skin, and it hurts. And it would be nice if the debate could change.
That is a wonderful thing to end on. Thank you so much, Sophie Grace.
Thank you, James and Tim.
Okay.
Have a good evening or afternoon, whichever comes your way.
Thank you.